Hello. This week we come to the 19th Sunday, and we want to begin by reminding everyone who is kind of watching this that one of the purposes, I hope, of our reflections is to look at, particularly this year, the gospel tradition according to Matthew. So some of the things that we will be discussing and looking at will not immediately be part of this upcoming set of scriptures. Although let me begin at least by giving what they will be. The first reading will be from the first book of Kings, chapter 19, verses 9a, and then verses 11 through 13a. The second reading will be from, again, the letter of Paul to the Romans, chapter 9, verses 1 through 5. And the gospel will be Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. So what I would like to do is to look at this whole chapter so far of Matthew, which will not be part of our readings, that is on Sunday. Now, chapter 14 might be divided so far into three sections. The first deals with the events that had to do with John the Baptist. Now, in this gospel, and of course it is true of others, this would be, to kind of put it into perspective, chapter 14, verses 1 through 12, pictures that Herod Tetrarch, who would be one of the sons, you remember, of Herod the Great. This would be the Herod whose territory of governing would be the Galilee and Perea, which would be the other side of the Jordan. So it was kind of split, although there was a way in which they were connected. Pictures Herod hearing about the fame of Jesus. And he asks, because he's not sure who this Jesus is this John the Baptist raised? Now, Herod, and here's now where Matthew picks up a story that is much more colorfully told in the gospel tradition of Mark, but for his own reasons, Matthew edits this story and presents it as part of his response to the question of who is Jesus. Herod, we know, had John the Baptist jailed. Now, the reason for his jailing, so the quote goes, is that the Baptist had said to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife, Herodias, who had been the wife of his brother Philip." Now, there is some argument about the reason for why Herod has John imprisoned. There are two viewpoints, the viewpoint certainly of Mark and therefore Matthew, but also the viewpoint of the Jewish historian of the time, Josephus. We've mentioned him before. He's a very important writer of the first century, common time, and he's very important because he gives us background of Judaism from the viewpoint of a fellow Jew, keeping in mind, of course, that Matthew's story is also the story of a group of Christians who still remain loyal to, in many ways, the tradition of Judaism. Now, Herod has John jailed. According to Josephus, the reason why he arrests John is, interestingly enough, for political reasons. There is the fear that the popularity of the Baptist might threaten something of his rule. And so therefore, it is not for so much a moral question or moral issue, but rather because of the possibility that he might threaten actually the ruling power of Herod. Now, John is imprisoned in a place called Machaerus, which is in the northeast corner of the Dead Sea, down in the Judean wilderness. Now, the court of Herod, this is where there's a differences here, is in Tiberias, which you remember is an important city that was built by Herod on the Sea of, or Lake of Galilee. All right. So, what's the real reason for imprisoning John? Is it that which is given by Josephus, or is it that which is given by the gospel writers? Now, even here, there is some inaccuracy. Herodias had first been married, there's a little bit of a background here, to the paternal half-uncle, okay, who was also named Herod, just to confuse things a little bit, whom she abandoned to marry Herod Antipas, who was also a half-uncle. So all of that is a little bit of a background for what was the reason for the imprisonment. How Herod is pictured goes about the execution of the Baptist is connected, certainly from the gospel tradition, with a banquet which Herod has, and he invites a number, and now this is where it becomes somewhat interesting, a number of royal, that is, political leaders of the time to this banquet. Now, was it his birthday or what's the occasion? We're not quite sure. And then we're told that at this banquet, a daughter named Salome comes and does a dance. And so impressed are they with this dance that Herod is pictured as saying to her, "Ask for whatever you want, even to half my kingdom." Now, it's always important to remember how relying Matthew is on Old Testament stories and traditions. And so what's the background here? Well, there's a background that goes back to the days of Jezebel, who, of course, was the wife of King Ahab. And in 1 Kings, there's a story where this kind of banquet takes place, and Jezebel engineers a demise of one of the courtiers of the time. Then there's also the book of Esther. And in the book of Esther, there is a banquet scene in which a dancing girl appears, and the then king says to her, "Ask for whatever you want, up to half my kingdom." So interestingly, how much do these stories, that certainly were well known by the audience of Matthew's time, provide a background for the narration that we hear with regard to John the Baptist? Anyway, in this famous story, you remember that the head of John the Baptist is asked for. He is executed. Now we're keeping in mind, if the celebration is at Tiberias and the place of imprisonment is really considerably a good distance away, but whatever is the actual reason, the beheading of the Baptist takes place. And you can see why Herod is pictured as raising the question, who is this Jesus? And when those who say that the Baptist has been raised, Herod will say, wait a minute, I made sure that he was dead, and there's going to be no risenness here. Now, that's the story that begins for chapter 14. The next verses, 13 through 21, and this would have been, by the way, the gospel that would have been read last time, but because of the observance, you remember, of the transfiguration of Jesus, a different gospel and a different way of looking at things took place. But the gospel would have been the feeding of the 5,000. And what this pictures, and here you can see some connection, Jesus, hearing of the death of the Baptist, seeks to withdraw to what we call a deserted place. Now, a deserted place does not necessarily mean a desert. It simply means a place where there weren't many people, or it was away from the local villages and towns. It is there that Jesus goes, but people hear where he is going, and he follows. And the picture says that Jesus then, when he sees all the folks there, continues teaching and also healing some who were sick. So that's the setting that follows. Notice the connection here, the Baptist story. Now pictures Jesus as looking out and finding that there are a significant number of people there, and says to the disciples, we really got to feed them. The disciples say, well, why don't you send them away so that they can go to the neighboring villages? Therefore, you can see that and buy what they need. So you can see this isn't a desert, but it simply is outside of more populated places. And Jesus says, well, why don't you feed them yourself? And they say, well, we have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus takes them. One remembers this story, a very popular story, by the way. This particular story, as we have mentioned on other occasions, is told 6 times by the 4 evangelists. And it is the only story that is told by all 4 of them, twice by Matthew, twice by Mark, and then once each by Luke and John. So all of the details of this you're quite familiar, except in this story, there's no real explanation as to why there are 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But Jesus has them sit down, breaks the bread, gives it to the disciples to feed, and points out that when everyone has had enough to eat, a collection is taken up and 12 baskets are full. The certainly language used here in this story does have Eucharistic overtones, because one notices that the words used by Jesus, he blesses, he breaks, and he gives, which are words, of course, that are found when we celebrate the Eucharist. So that leads others to think that perhaps that was something that the writer had in mind. Although, once again, I come back to this, there is the Hebrew background. And in the Old Testament, there is a story connected, you remember, with Elisha, who was the successor to the prophet Elijah, who orders his servants on one occasion to set down 20 loaves of barley bread and some ears of grain so that he can feed 100 men who have gathered there. Now, keep in mind, 20 loaves wouldn't really go too far ordinarily with 100, but in a wonderful way, all of the 100 get enough to eat, and there are even leftovers. So you can see, again, perhaps a parallel story here that Matthew has in mind, something that the great prophet of the past could do, but Jesus can do even in a grander way. So if you have 100 men, now you have 5,000 men. And it's interesting in this gospel that Matthew mentions 5,000 men, not counting women and children. So if you put that together, you would certainly have quite a large number there. It's also interesting, by the way, perhaps a little bit of social background here is important, that when people sit down, they sit down according to designated groupings. Men and young boys would eat and sit together. Boys under the age of puberty and women and girls would eat separately. So they would eat in their own group. When we think that they're all scattered around, might make a nice portrait that artists have, but wouldn't perhaps been the way in which this was actually done. So again, a little bit of a cultural background here of how this would work. Now, the fact that there are leftovers, of course, is important, but perhaps the real connection here, as Matthew presents it, is a contrast between 2 banquets. You have the banquet now we go back to the story we mentioned earlier, given by Herod, in which he invites the local important people to a supper. And Jesus, now who is on the hillside, invites all people, ordinary people, to a different kind of banquet. No one is excluded. You don't need a special invitation to come to this banquet. And so everyone, of course, the commonality here is, in Herod's case, only certain people got fed. Here, in Jesus' case, everyone is fed. So it's this interesting contrast, again, very typical, you remember, of the Matthean understanding that Jesus is the new Moses, that Jesus is the new teacher, that Jesus is truly the new great prophet. And here, everyone should be fed and everyone should have enough to eat. So all of that is the background now to the episode that we will be looking at this time. But I think it is, as I mentioned, important to notice the continuity here, because having now fed the 5,000, we don't know, well, we do see what happens is Jesus says to his disciples, get in a boat and cross over the lake. I will stay behind and dissipate the crowd. Now, how you can kind of smile and say, wow, 5,000 people and more, all being kind of sent home and going in a peaceful way. So there's a little bit of literary kind of technique taking place here. But it's at this point that once the crowd is dispersed, Jesus goes up a hill, well, now a mountain, but up a hill to pray. Interestingly, this is the only time in Matthew's story so far that we have had any mention that Jesus prays. He had spoken about prayer earlier on in the gospel, but never does Jesus himself pictured as praying. So he prays, and when he is finished, so that brings us to later into the night, that Jesus then comes down and goes to join his disciples. Now the disciples are, and I mention this only quickly in passing because we have looked at this at other times, find the disciples in a boat on the Lake of Gennesareth or the Sea of Galilee, depending on what title you wanted to use to it. We mentioned before that in the year 1986, the level of the Sea of Galilee became extraordinarily low, and marine archaeologists discovered an ancient fishing boat in the mud along the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. A little bit from a place called Magdala, or today Migdal, M-I-G-D-A-L, is the place that you can see this. And in uncovering this boat, now keep it was covered in mud, so they had to do it very careful, have determined that the boat was created or made sometime between the year 40 before the Common Time and 70 of the Common Time. So this boat is placed, therefore, into the time frame when most likely Jesus and his disciples lived. Now, the boat, we've probably have seen pictures of it and talked about it before, has gone through a long process of being reconstructed. It's 26.5 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, and 4.5 feet deep. So we also know that this boat contained 4 oarsmen and a tillerman, and could have up to 10 passengers. Or if you just had the crew, then you can see where they would be able to put fish and whatever else they collected. So all of that is a background of what kind of boat this was. just before dawn. Now, does that mean anything? In a certain way, it is the darkest time of the day, by the way. Jesus joins his disciples by walking on the water. Now, Matthew has two water stories. This is the second time that this story is seen. The disciples are pictured as dealing with a strong headwind, which, by the way, a strong headwind would raise up the waves and could batter, of course, into the side of the boat. And so you have frightened passengers who, when they look out and see Jesus walking on the water, think that it is a ghost. Jesus says, "No, it is I." Now, of course, that phrase, "it is I," might be again connected back to words which were spoken, you remember, to Moses long ago and far away when God appeared to him on the mount. Moses had asked the name of God, and God said, "I am, it is I." So is there to be a connection here between the phrase that Jesus is pictured as giving to his disciples and that Old Testament connection? Notice continually how Matthew is reliant on and dependent on and develops the New Testament image of Jesus against the background of the Old, reminding one of a phrase that he had used earlier on in this gospel, that a wise person knows how to bring the good things that are important at the same time by respecting the old. So in fact, Matthew does what his wise saying suggests. All right. So it is typical, someone is say that, says, well, what about ghosts? Do you believe in ghosts? Okay. Well, the first century Mediterranean believed that there were spirits, and that often these spirits emerged in the wind and in the waves. So you have to kind of put the background there. And the only way for human beings was to find a more powerful spirit to counter the annoying spirit. So you see, here is Jesus now having the powerful Spirit of God able to calm the waves. And now, as he's standing there on the water, and here we come to a section that is exclusive to Matthew, namely Peter, who is one of the disciples in the boat, says to Jesus, "Can I also walk on the water?" And Jesus says to him, "Go ahead." And Peter is pictured as stepping outside of the boat and begins to walk on the water. And then, of course, you can only imagine, he looks down and sees what is happening, and he begins to sink and calls out, "Lord, save me." Jesus says to him, "Why don't you, if you only had faith, your faith failed you here." Now, how this concludes, we can only think, is that Jesus then comes and he and Peter enter the boat together, and that completes the story. So the walking on the water, again, Jesus conquering and through the power and grace of God, the forces of water. Water, you remember, always, well, not always, but often was considered to be a threatening kind of place, although the Sea of Galilee wasn't all that bad. But now, do we criticize Peter a little for walking on the water? Well, primary message that certainly Matthew has in mind here is that Jesus does what God does and speaks as God does in the Bible. So in a way, this whole scene, again, is what we might call an epiphany scene. Jesus is seen in another way, in a different light. He is seen as the Son of God. So keep all of that in mind with some of the readings we have been listening to, particularly, remember last week, the Transfiguration. The disciples see Jesus in a different way. Here, also, they see him in a certain way. We might criticize Peter for having a lack of faith, but on the other hand, let's give Peter credit for willingness to take the step forward. Real faith sometimes requires that we move forward even when sometimes we're going to fail. Faith doesn't mean that we will always be successful, but it does mean that, and this perhaps is one of the messages that Matthew has in mind, and Peter, of course, in this gospel is the kind of spokesperson for the disciples, is that unless we take a step forward, unless we move toward Jesus, maybe nothing really will happen. For a moment, let us look now at the first book of Kings, which takes us back to Elijah's time. Elijah, of course, you remember, is the great prophet who had challenged the king Ahab and his wife Jezebel, had won a victory at Mount Carmel or Mount Carmel, and had ended a drought that had plagued the land for over 3.5 years. Unfortunately, after the victory, this had been, of course, the test, you might remember, whose sacrifice would be accepted, that of the gods called Baal or that of the God of Israel. Gods of Israel had won, but Elijah had kind of necked, there's a little bit of violence here, 450 priests of Jezebel. Understandably, Jezebel was not happy with that, and Elijah is pictured as having to flee. He's not going to be protected by Ahab. As he does, and there's a series of stories in this regard, he finally winds up, and this is the episode that we hear, at a cave on Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. It goes by both names. And as he is standing now, they call this a cave, but we might think this as a kind of opening in a cliff against the side of this little uprising. Waits for God. And as the story we will hear, God is not found in a strong wind, not found in an earthquake, not found in fire, but is found in, and this is a beautiful little phrase, a gentle whisper, or as some translators have it, a sound of silence. Now, a still small voice is another way in which this expression of how Elijah meets God. God is saying to Elijah, I don't want you to leave, because prior to this, and this is left out in the reading, Elijah had contemplated suicide. He had said, I had it, I can't take any more. No one is listening to me. I do what you say, but it doesn't have any real lasting effect. Well, God here is saying, no, Elijah, you have work to do. Your message will have an effect. And that, of course, is what takes place here. Once again, just keep in mind that although Elijah is certainly an Old Testament person, when God had appeared to Moses, it had been in thunder, earthquake, fire, invading cloud. So again, there's a little bit of a contrast here between Elijah and Moses, who, as we noticed last time, are the two great ones, Moses, the law, Elijah, the prophet. So this, now in conclusion, are two really what we call theophanies, revelations of God. Here in Elijah's time, the revelation of God in this small, silent voice. And in the gospel, the revelation of God in Jesus walking on the waters and conquering the fear that is connected with waters. So, all of that this week are some things for us to consider as we gather. For us, the waters turn out to be the way of salvation. Christians, of course, use the idea of water for baptism. Well, walk on the waters of life this time, Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.